The morning Thessaly Voss discovered her neighbor eating his own dog marked the end of the world as she knew it. She had been watering her petunias when the screaming started, a sound that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her shortened life. Through the chain-link fence, she watched Garrett Holbrook, the mild-mannered accountant who always waved from his porch, tear into the golden retriever's flesh with teeth that seemed too sharp, too eager. His eyes had turned milky white, and dark veins spider-webbed across his pale skin like ink spreading through water. Thessaly dropped her watering can, the metal clanging against the concrete as she stumbled backward. The sound drew Garrett's attention, and when he turned toward her, she saw that the man she'd known for 3 years was gone. Something else wore his face now, something hungry and wrong. He pressed against the fence, fingers clawing through the gaps, mouth opening and closing in silent hunger. Black blood dripped from his chin. The emergency broadcasts had started 2 days earlier, but Thessaly, like most people, had assumed it was another media panic. Reports of a viral outbreak in major cities seemed distant and unreal from her quiet suburb in Millbrook. The government assured everyone it was contained, that the military had everything under control. They were wrong about everything. Across town, Zephyr Nakamura was performing surgery when the lights went out. The backup generators kicked in immediately, but something was different about the darkness that had settled over St. Catherine's Hospital. Through the operating room windows, he could see fires burning in the distance, and the usual hum of the city had been replaced by something else, screaming, sirens, and underneath it all, a low moaning that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Doctor, we need to evacuate," his surgical nurse, Indira Castellanos, whispered urgently. She had been monitoring the radio between procedures, and her face was pale with fear. "The infection, it's here. The emergency room is overrun." Zephyr looked down at his patient, a young woman who had been in a car accident. She was stable but would need hours more surgery to save her leg. Outside, the moaning grew louder, and he could hear something heavy being dragged across the floor in the hallway beyond the operating room doors. Meanwhile, in the basement of the Millbrook Community Center, Caspian Reeves was teaching his evening self-defense class when the first infected broke through the windows above. Glass rained down on the mats where a dozen people had been learning basic martial arts moves. What fell through the broken windows barely looked human anymore, twisted figures with gray skin and black eyes, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. The class scattered in panic, but Caspian stood his ground. Years of military training had taught him to assess threats quickly, and what he saw defied everything he understood about human physiology. These things moved despite injuries that should have been fatal. One had a compound fracture in its arm, bone jutting through skin, but it showed no signs of pain or weakness. "Everyone to the back exit!" Caspian shouted, grabbing a wooden practice sword from the wall. The first infected lunged at him with surprising speed, and he swung the weapon with all his strength. It connected with the creature's skull with a wet crack, but instead of falling, it grabbed the sword and tried to pull him closer to its snapping teeth. In the suburbs, Thessaly was calling 911 when she heard her front door splinter. The phone line was dead, had been for hours, but she kept dialing anyway, as if the familiar motion could somehow restore normalcy to a world that had suddenly become a nightmare. Heavy footsteps echoed through her house, accompanied by that terrible moaning she'd heard from Garrett. She grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the living room, her heart hammering against her ribs. The front door hung open, and muddy footprints led across her white carpet. But it wasn't just mud, the prints were dark red, and they led directly to her hallway closet where she kept her winter coats. The moaning was coming from inside the closet. As night fell over Millbrook, the 3 strangers who would soon become unlikely allies faced their first encounters with the undead. None of them knew that within hours, they would be forced to abandon everything they thought they knew about themselves. The accountant, the surgeon, and the instructor were about to discover that survival required more than just staying alive. It demanded transformation into something harder, something capable of fighting monsters that had once been human. The old world was ending, and the new one would be written in blood. Thessaly pressed her back against the kitchen wall, knife trembling in her grip as the closet door slowly creaked open. What emerged wasn't Garrett, it was Mrs. Chen from 2 houses down, still wearing her floral housecoat, but her face was a ruin of gray flesh and exposed bone. the elderly woman who had brought Thessaly homemade dumplings just last week now moved with predatory intent, her fingers ending in what looked like blackened claws. The infected woman's head turned toward Thessaly with mechanical precision, and when their eyes met, Thessaly saw nothing human left behind those milky orbs. Mrs. Chen's mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing teeth that had grown sharp and numerous, like a shark's. The sound that emerged was part shriek, part moan, and entirely wrong. Thessaly ran. She burst through her back door and into the night, the kitchen knife still clutched in her fist. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Chen giving chase, but the infected woman moved with an awkward, shambling gait that gave Thessaly a crucial head start. The suburban street that had been her safe haven for years now felt like a maze of shadows and potential death. At the hospital, Zephyr had made the impossible choice to abandon his patient. The operating room doors were buckling under the weight of bodies pressing against them from the outside, and Indira had barricaded them with surgical equipment. Through the small window in the door, they could see the hallway filled with infected hospital staff and patients, their medical gowns stained with blood and worse things. The roof, Indira whispered, pointing to the emergency exit that led to the hospital's upper levels. There's a helicopter pad. Maybe someone's still evacuating people. Zephyr nodded, though he knew it was likely a false hope. The radio chatter they had been monitoring painted a picture of complete societal collapse. Military units were going dark, evacuation centers were being overrun, and the infection was spreading faster than anyone had predicted. Still, movement meant survival, and staying in the operating room meant certain death. They gathered what medical supplies they could carry and made their way to the stairwell. The hospital's emergency lighting cast everything in a hellish red glow, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and disinfectant. As they climbed, they could hear the infected breaking through the operating room doors below, their hungry moans echoing up the stairwell like the voices of the damned. Caspian had managed to lead most of his class to safety through the community center's back exit, but 3 people hadn't made it. He'd watched helplessly as the infected overwhelmed them, their screams cutting through the night air like broken glass. Now he stood in the parking lot with the survivors, a mix of housewives, college students, and retirees who had signed up for self-defense classes, never imagining they'd need to defend themselves against the walking dead. "We need weapons," said Lyra Blackwood, a librarian who had surprised everyone by keeping her composure during the attack. She was methodically checking the cars in the parking lot, looking for anything useful. "And we need to get out of the open. Those things hunt in packs." Caspian had noticed that too. The infected seemed to communicate with each other through their moaning, and when one found prey, others quickly converged on the location. It suggested a level of coordination that made them far more dangerous than mindless zombies. These creatures retained some primitive intelligence, some pack instinct that made them efficient killers. "My house is 6 blocks from here," offered Tobias Grimm, a retired mechanic whose weathered hands were surprisingly steady despite the chaos. "I've got tools, maybe some guns. It's defensible." As they debated their next move, Thessaly came running down the street, her nightgown torn and bloody. She'd been moving from shadow to shadow, avoiding the infected that seemed to be everywhere now. The knife in her hand was slick with black blood. She'd been forced to use it twice already, and each time had been harder than the last. Killing things that looked human, even when they clearly weren't human anymore, went against every instinct she possessed. "Help me," she gasped as she reached the group. "Please, they're everywhere. My whole neighborhood is gone." Caspian stepped forward, his military training kicking in. He could see that Thessaly was in shock but still functional, still capable of following orders. That made her valuable in a world where panic meant death. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Thessaly. Thessaly Voss. I lived, on Maple Street. I'm Caspian. We're going to get somewhere safe, but I need you to stay calm and do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that?" Thessaly nodded, though her eyes kept darting to the shadows around them. In the distance, they could all hear the sound of breaking glass and screaming, punctuated by the occasional gunshot. The city was tearing itself apart, and they were caught in the middle of it with nothing but improvised weapons and desperate hope. Above them, a helicopter passed overhead, its searchlight sweeping the streets below. For a moment, they all looked up with desperate hope, but the aircraft didn't stop. It continued toward the horizon, leaving them alone in the darkness with the growing army of the dead. The transformation had begun, though none of them realized it yet. The soft, civilized people they had been that morning were already starting to die, replaced by something harder and more ruthless. Survival would demand nothing less than the complete abandonment of who they used to be. The helicopter's fading rotor wash stirred the autumn leaves around them as Caspian's group made their way through the darkened streets toward Tobias's house. They moved in single file, with Caspian taking point and Lyra bringing up the rear, her librarian's attention to detail making her surprisingly good at watching for threats. Thessaly walked in the middle, still clutching her bloodied knife, her eyes wide but focused. They had gone 2 blocks when they encountered their first real test. A family of 4 infected blocked the intersection ahead, a father, mother, and 2 children who couldn't have been older than 8. The children still wore their school clothes, though the fabric was torn and stained with gore. The sight of them made Thessaly's stomach lurch, but it was Lyra who spoke the words they were all thinking. "We can't go around them," she whispered. "They'll follow our scent, and there might be more behind us." Caspian hefted the crowbar he'd taken from the community center's maintenance closet. The weight of it felt familiar in his hands, though he'd never imagined using it as a weapon against children. But these weren't children anymore, they were predators wearing the faces of innocence, and hesitation would get them all killed. "I'll handle it," he said quietly. "No." Thessaly stepped forward, surprising them all. "I'll do it. You need to save your strength for the real fights." There was something different in her voice now, a hardness that hadn't been there an hour ago. Caspian studied her face and saw the change beginning. The soft suburban housewife was dying, replaced by someone capable of making impossible choices. He nodded and stepped aside. Thessaly approached the infected family with careful, measured steps. The father noticed her first, his head snapping up with predatory alertness. When he opened his mouth to moan, she drove the knife up through his jaw and into his brain with surgical precision. The motion was clean, efficient, and utterly without hesitation. The mother lunged next, and Thessaly sidestepped, bringing the knife down into the base of her skull. The children came together, their small hands reaching for her with desperate hunger, and she killed them both with quick, merciful strikes. When it was over, she stood among the bodies, breathing heavily but steady. "Jesus," Tobias muttered. "Where did you learn to do that?" "I didn't," Thessaly replied, wiping the blade clean on her torn nightgown. "I just knew." Meanwhile, across town, Zephyr and Indira had reached the hospital roof only to find it empty. The helicopter pad was stained with blood, and the radio equipment had been smashed. Worse, they could see infected climbing the external fire escapes, drawn by the scent of living flesh. They had minutes before the roof would be overrun. The medical building next door, Indira pointed to a shorter structure connected to the hospital by a skybridge. "If we can get across, we might be able to get down to street level." The skybridge was a glass-enclosed walkway that connected the hospital to the medical office building. Through its windows, they could see infected wandering the hallways below, but the bridge itself appeared clear. It was their only option. They ran across the bridge as the first infected reached the roof behind them. The glass walls amplified their footsteps, and Zephyr could see the creatures below looking up at the sound. Some began climbing the walls with impossible agility, their fingers finding purchase on surfaces that should have been smooth. "They're learning," Zephyr said as they reached the other side. "Adapting." "What do you mean?" "When this started, they were slow, clumsy. Now look at them." He gestured to the infected scaling the building's exterior. "They're becoming more efficient predators." The medical building's stairwell was dark and filled with the sound of dripping water. As they descended, they could hear movement in the floors below, the shuffle of feet, the scrape of fingernails against walls, and that constant, low moaning that seemed to be the infected's form of communication. On the 3rd floor, they encountered Dr. Evander Cross, Zephyr's colleague from the emergency department. Or what had been Dr. Cross. The man was still wearing his white coat, but his face was a ruin of gray flesh and black veins. When he saw them, he smiled with too many teeth. "Zephyr," the thing that had been Dr. Cross said, its voice a wet whisper. "Join us. It doesn't hurt anymore." The fact that it could speak, that it remembered his name, sent ice through Zephyr's veins. These weren't mindless zombies, they were something far worse. They retained memories, intelligence, but all of it was twisted toward a single purpose: spreading the infection. Indira raised the scalpel she'd been carrying, but Zephyr stopped her. "Run," he said quietly. "I'll handle this. I'm not leaving you." "That's an order, Nurse Castellanos." The authority in his voice made her hesitate, and in that moment, Zephyr pushed her toward the stairwell and turned to face his former colleague. Dr. Cross lunged with inhuman speed, but Zephyr was ready. Years of precise surgical movements served him well as he drove a bone saw into the creature's temple, ending its mockery of life. When he caught up with Indira on the ground floor, she was crying. "How many more?" she asked. "How many people we know are going to become those things?" "All of them," Zephyr said quietly. "Unless we find a way to stop this." Outside, Caspian's group had reached Tobias's house, a modest two-story home with a detached garage. The old mechanic led them around to the back, where he kept his tools and, more importantly, his gun safe. As he worked the combination, they could hear infected moving through the neighborhood, their moans creating a symphony of hunger that seemed to come from every direction. "Got it," Tobias said, opening the safe to reveal 3 hunting rifles and a shotgun, along with several boxes of ammunition. "It's not much, but it's better than knives and crowbars." Lyra picked up one of the rifles, checking the action with surprising familiarity. "My father taught me to hunt," she explained when she saw their surprised looks. "Never thought I'd be hunting people." "They're not people anymore," Thessaly said, her voice flat and emotionless. "People don't eat their neighbors' dogs." As they distributed the weapons and ammunition, none of them noticed the change that was occurring within themselves. The soft edges of civilization were being worn away by necessity, replaced by something harder and more primal. They were becoming what they needed to be to survive, warriors in a war they never asked to fight. Outside, the moaning grew louder, and they could see shapes moving past the windows. The infected had found them, and the real test was about to begin. The first infected broke through Tobias's front window at 2:17 a.m., its gray hands clawing through the glass with mechanical persistence. Thessaly, who had been keeping watch from the living room, didn't hesitate. She raised the hunting rifle Lyra had shown her how to use and put a bullet through the creature's forehead. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the house like thunder, and within seconds, they could hear answering moans from every direction. "That's torn it," Tobias muttered, chambering around in his shotgun. "They'll all come running now." Caspian was already moving, his military training taking over. "Lyra, upstairs windows. Thessaly, kitchen. Tobias, you're with me on the front door." He paused, looking at each of them. "Remember, headshots only. Body shots just slow them down." The next wave came from 3 directions at once. Infected poured through the broken front window while others hammered at the kitchen door and the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. The sound was deafening, breaking glass, splintering wood, and underneath it all, that terrible hungry moaning that seemed to vibrate in their bones. Thessaly found herself face to face with what had once been a teenage boy, his Letterman jacket torn and bloody. For a split second, she hesitated, seeing the child he had been rather than the monster he had become. That hesitation nearly cost her life as the infected teenager lunged forward with surprising speed. She pulled the trigger at point-blank range, and the creature's head exploded in a spray of black blood and gray matter. Upstairs, Lyra was picking off infected as they climbed the exterior walls of the house. Her shots were precise, methodical, each bullet finding its mark with the patience she'd learned from years of cataloging books. But for every one she killed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The horde was growing, drawn by the sound of gunfire and the scent of living flesh. "We can't hold this position," Caspian shouted over the chaos. He had emptied his rifle twice and was now using Tobias's crowbar to cave in skulls as infected poured through the front door. "We need to move." "The garage," Tobias called back, crushing an infected woman's skull with the butt of a shotgun. "I've got a truck." They fought their way through the house, leaving a trail of destroyed infected in their wake. Thessaly moved with fluid grace, the rifle becoming an extension of her will. Each shot was perfect, each movement economical. The suburban housewife was gone completely now, replaced by something that killed without emotion or hesitation. In the garage, Tobias's pickup truck sat like salvation. But between them and the vehicle were a dozen infected that had broken through the garage door. Caspian looked at his companions, these people who had been strangers hours ago but were now bound together by blood and necessity. "Together," he said simply. They moved as one, a coordinated killing machine that would have been impossible to imagine that morning. Thessaly and Lyra provided covering fire while Caspian and Tobias cleared a path with melee weapons. The infected fell before them like wheat before a scythe, but not without cost. Tobias took a deep gash across his forearm from infected fingernails, and Lyra's left shoulder was bleeding from where one of the creatures had managed to grab her. They piled into the truck as more infected poured into the garage. Tobias gunned the engine and smashed through the remaining garage door, crushing several infected under the truck's wheels. Behind them, his house was completely overrun, dark shapes moving through every window. "Where to?" Tobias asked, his hands steady on the wheel despite the blood running down his arm. "The hospital," Thessaly said without hesitation. "If there are any other survivors, that's where they'll go." "The hospital's overrun," Lyra pointed out. "We heard it on the radio." "Then we take it back," Thessaly replied, her voice cold as winter steel. Across town, Zephyr and Indira had found temporary refuge in a pharmacy that had been barricaded by its owner before he fled. They had medical supplies in a defensible position, but they were trapped. The streets outside were filled with infected, and their numbers seemed to be growing by the hour. "It's not random," Zephyr said, studying the creatures through the pharmacy's reinforced windows. "Look at how they move, how they coordinate. There's intelligence there." Indira followed his gaze and saw what he meant. The infected weren't wandering aimlessly, they were patrolling, searching systematically for survivors. Some carried crude weapons, and they seemed to be learning from each encounter, adapting their tactics. "They're evolving," she whispered. "Rapidly. Whatever this infection is, it's not just reanimating dead tissue. It's improving it, making it more efficient." Zephyr turned away from the window, his face grim. "We're not fighting zombies. We're fighting something that's actively trying to replace humanity." A sound from the back of the pharmacy made them both freeze. It was soft, almost musical, like someone humming a lullaby. But there was something wrong with the melody, something that made their skin crawl. They crept toward the sound, weapons ready. In the pharmacy's back office, they found the source, a little girl, maybe 6 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor. She was humming while she played with something in her lap. When she looked up at them, her eyes were the milky white of the infected, but her smile was perfectly human. "Hello," she said in a voice like broken glass. "Would you like to play with me?" In her lap was a human heart, still beating. Zephyr raised his weapon, but Indira grabbed his arm. "She's just a child," she whispered. "No," Zephyr said quietly. "She's not." The thing that looked like a little girl tilted its head, studying them with predatory interest. "You smell different," it said. "Stronger. You'll make good soldiers when you join us." "Join you?" Indira asked, despite herself. "The new world is coming," the creature replied, its child's voice carrying impossible authority. "The weak will feed the strong, and the strong will inherit the earth. You can choose to be food, or you can choose to be family." Zephyr pulled the trigger, ending the abomination's existence. But its words echoed in the silence that followed, carrying a terrible promise of what was to come. Outside, Tobias's truck roared through the empty streets toward the hospital, carrying 4 people who were no longer entirely human themselves. They had crossed a line that night, shed their old selves like snakes shedding skin. They were becoming something new, something capable of fighting monsters. But as they would soon discover, the greatest monsters weren't the infected shambling through the streets. The greatest monsters were what they themselves were becoming, and what they would have to become to survive in a world where humanity itself was under siege. The hospital loomed ahead, dark and silent, waiting for them like a tomb. The hospital parking lot was a graveyard of abandoned vehicles and scattered medical equipment. Thessaly counted at least 30 bodies in the emergency room entrance alone, though it was impossible to tell which had been patients and which had been staff. The building itself seemed to pulse with malevolent life, shadows moving behind broken windows like parasites in a corpse. Motion sensors are still active, Caspian observed, pointing to the red lights blinking near the main entrance. That means there's still power, which means someone might still be alive in there, Lyra finished. She had found a pair of binoculars in Tobias's glove compartment and was scanning the upper floors. Third floor, east wing. I see a light moving around. Flashlight, maybe. Thessaly checked her rifle for the dozenth time, her movements precise and automatic. The weapon felt natural in her hands now, as if she'd been born holding it. We go in quiet, extract any survivors, and get out. No heroics. Since when did you become the tactical expert? Tobias asked, though there was no challenge in his voice. Something about Thessaly's transformation commanded respect, even from a man who'd seen combat in Vietnam. Since I stopped being the kind of person who waters petunias while the world ends, she replied. They approached the hospital through the loading dock, where the smell of decay was overwhelming. The infected had been feeding here, and the evidence was scattered across the concrete in pieces too small to identify. Caspian led them through a service entrance, his crowbar ready, while the others followed in tactical formation that none of them remembered learning. The hospital's interior was a maze of overturned gurneys and medical equipment. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, and the air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and death. They could hear movement in the walls, scratching, scuttling sounds that suggested the infected had made this place their nest. Elevators are out, Lyra whispered, checking the control panel. Stairs it is. The stairwell was worse than the hallways. Bodies were stacked like cordwood on each landing, and the walls were covered in what looked like claw marks. But it wasn't random violence, there was a pattern to the destruction, a deliberate arrangement that suggested intelligence behind the carnage. They're marking territory, Thessaly realized. Like animals. On the second floor, they found their first survivor. Dr. Evander Cross, the real one, not the infected mockery they'd encountered earlier, was barricaded in a supply closet with 2 nurses and a security guard. He was delirious with fever, and his left arm was wrapped in bloody bandages. Bite? Caspian asked, though he already knew the answer. 3 hours ago, one of the nurses, a young woman named Petra Vance, replied. He's been fighting it, but I'm losing, Dr. Cross finished, his voice barely a whisper. You need to get to the 3rd floor. Dr. Nakamura and Nurse Castellanos are up there with the research data. They think they've found something. Thessaly knelt beside the dying doctor. What kind of something? The infection, it's not what we thought. It's not a virus or bacteria. It's something else, something that rewrites DNA in real time. But there might be a way to stop it, to reverse it. His eyes focused on her with desperate intensity. You have to get them out. The data they have, it might be humanity's only chance. Dr. Cross died 20 minutes later, and Thessaly put a bullet in his brain before he could reanimate. The sound echoed through the hospital like a bell tolling for the dead, and they could hear answering calls from the infected throughout the building. They know we're here now, Caspian said grimly. The 3rd floor was a war zone. Infected medical staff and patients roamed the hallways in packs, their movements coordinated and purposeful. But these weren't the shambling zombies they'd fought earlier. These creatures moved with predatory grace, using medical equipment as weapons and setting ambushes with tactical precision. They found Zephyr and Indira in the research lab, surrounded by computer equipment and stacks of data printouts. Both looked exhausted, but their eyes held the same hard gleam that had developed in the others, the look of people who had seen too much and survived anyway. Thank God, Indira breathed when she saw them. We thought we were the only ones left. What did you find? Thessaly asked without preamble. Zephyr gestured to the computer screens around them. The infection isn't natural. It's engineered, designed to create a new form of life that's superior to baseline humanity in every way. Stronger, faster, more intelligent, and completely unified in purpose. Unified how? Hive mind. Every infected individual is connected to a central intelligence that coordinates their actions. They're not just hunting us, they're farming us, keeping some alive to spread the infection while using others as food to fuel their transformation. Lyra studied the data with her librarian's eye for detail. This says the infection has a 97% success rate. What happens to the other 3%? They become something else, Zephyr replied quietly. Something that can fight back. The implications hit them all at once. They weren't just survivors, they were the 3%, the ones whose genetic makeup had allowed them to resist the infection while gaining some of its benefits. They were faster, stronger, more coordinated than they had been that morning. They were becoming something new, something that could stand against the infected horde. We need to get this data to the military, Indira said. If there are others like us. There are, Thessaly interrupted. I can feel them. Can't you? They all could, now that she mentioned it. A subtle awareness of other minds, other survivors scattered throughout the city. The infection had tried to connect them to its hive mind and failed, but it had left them connected to each other instead. How many? Caspian asked. Thessaly closed her eyes, reaching out with senses she didn't understand. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. They're fighting, surviving, becoming what we've become. A sound from the hallway made them all freeze, footsteps, but not the shambling gait of the infected. These were measured, purposeful, almost military in their precision. Through the lab's reinforced windows, they saw a figure approaching that made their blood run cold. It had once been human, but the infection had transformed it into something else entirely. Taller, more muscular, with skin that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. Its eyes glowed with intelligence that was both alien and terrifyingly familiar. The first of the new breed, Zephyr whispered. The infection's attempt at creating a perfect predator. The creature stopped outside the lab door and spoke in a voice that carried the authority of absolute certainty. You cannot hide forever, little ones. Join us willingly, and your transformation will be gentle. Resist, and we will take you piece by piece. Thessaly raised her rifle, but she knew bullets wouldn't stop this thing. They were facing something that represented the next stage of the infection's evolution, and their own transformation was far from complete. The war for humanity's future was about to begin in earnest, and they were the first soldiers in an army they didn't yet understand. The creature outside the lab door didn't break down the barrier, it simply placed its hand against the reinforced steel and began to change the molecular structure of the metal itself. They watched in horrified fascination as the door started to dissolve, becoming liquid and flowing away like water. Impossible, Zephyr breathed, but even as he said it, he could feel something stirring within his own cells, a potential that had been dormant until this moment. Thessaly stepped forward, her rifle forgotten. Something was happening to her, a transformation that went beyond the physical changes they'd all experienced. Her skin began to shimmer with the same metallic quality as the creature's, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated in frequencies beyond human hearing. You're not the only one who can evolve, she said to the creature. The thing that had once been human tilted its head, studying her with newfound interest. Fascinating. You're adapting faster than our models predicted. But you're still incomplete, still clinging to your obsolete humanity. Maybe, Thessaly replied, but we're not alone. Throughout the city, the other 3%ers were experiencing the same awakening. Caspian could feel them like points of light in his consciousness, a network of minds that shared information instantaneously. A group of survivors in the financial district had discovered that the infected were vulnerable to certain electromagnetic frequencies. A family barricaded in a church had learned that the creatures avoided areas with high concentrations of iron oxide. A lone soldier in the ruins of the military base had found that the infection could be temporarily suppressed with a combination of adrenaline and specific neurotransmitters. All of this knowledge flowed between them in seconds, creating a collective intelligence that rivaled the infected hive mind. But unlike the infected, they retained their individuality, their humanity, even as they transcended its limitations. "We are the bridge," Lyra said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. "Not human, not infected, but something new. Something that can exist between both worlds." The creature outside the lab paused in its dissolution of the door. "You think you can resist us? You think your small network can stand against the collective will of billions?" "Not resist," Thessaly said, her transformation accelerating. Her body was becoming something fluid and adaptable, capable of reshaping itself at will. Replace. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred on Earth. It wasn't fought with weapons or physical force, but with competing visions of what humanity could become. The infected creature tried to overwhelm them with the weight of its collective consciousness, the combined will of every infected mind on the planet. But the 3%ers fought back with something the infected couldn't understand: choice. Each member of their network remained an individual, contributing their unique perspective to the whole while maintaining their essential self. They were stronger together, but not subsumed by the collective. Zephyr found himself able to manipulate biological systems at the cellular level, rewriting genetic code in real time. Indira discovered she could interface directly with electronic systems, her consciousness flowing through computer networks like data. Tobias's mechanical knowledge expanded to encompass any technology he touched, allowing him to understand and control complex systems instinctively. Caspian became something like a general, coordinating the actions of 3%ers across the city through their shared network. His military training merged with enhanced cognitive abilities to create tactical solutions that no single human mind could have conceived. And Thessaly became something else entirely. She was the nexus, the living bridge between what humanity had been and what it could become. Her consciousness expanded beyond the confines of her physical form, touching every member of their network while simultaneously reaching out to the infected hive mind itself. What she found there horrified and amazed her in equal measure. The infected weren't evil, they were afraid. The intelligence that controlled them was ancient, older than human civilization, and it had watched species after species destroy themselves through war, pollution, and short-sighted greed. The infection was its attempt to save life on Earth by creating something that could survive humanity's mistakes. "You're trying to preserve us," she said to the creature, her voice now carrying across multiple dimensions of reality. "But you're destroying what makes us worth preserving." The infected intelligence paused, and for a moment, Thessaly felt its confusion. It had expected resistance, had planned for violence and fear. But it hadn't anticipated understanding, hadn't prepared for the possibility that its opponents might see its perspective while still choosing a different path. "Your species is flawed," the creature replied, its voice now uncertain. "You destroy everything you touch. We offer perfection, unity, survival. We offer something better," Thessaly said. "We offer choice." Through the network, she showed the infected intelligence what the 3%ers had become, individuals who had transcended human limitations while retaining human values. They were stronger than baseline humans but not enslaved to a collective will. They could adapt and evolve but chose to preserve diversity rather than enforce uniformity. "This is impossible," the creature said, but its certainty was cracking. "Evolution requires selection pressure. Survival demands unity of purpose. Evolution requires change," Caspian interjected, his consciousness joining the conversation. "But it doesn't require the elimination of choice. We can be better than we were without becoming something we're not." The infected intelligence recoiled, its ancient certainties challenged by a possibility it had never considered. For millennia, it had believed that consciousness was binary, either individual and chaotic, or collective and ordered. The 3%ers represented a third option, a synthesis that preserved the strengths of both while eliminating their weaknesses. "Show us," the creature said finally. What followed was not a battle but a demonstration. The 3%ers opened their network to the infected intelligence, allowing it to experience their form of consciousness directly. It felt their unity without uniformity, their strength without subjugation, their evolution without the loss of essential humanity. The infected creature in the lab began to change, its metallic skin softening, its glowing eyes returning to something more recognizably human. Throughout the city, other infected paused in their hunting, their hive mind connection flickering as they experienced something they had never known: doubt. This is difficult, the intelligence admitted. To maintain individual consciousness while sharing collective knowledge requires a level of mental discipline we did not believe possible. It is possible, Lyra said, her librarian's mind organizing the flow of information between them. But it requires trust. Trust that others will choose cooperation over domination, growth over stagnation, diversity over uniformity. And if they choose wrongly? Then we guide them, Thessaly replied. We teach them. We show them a better way. But we don't force them. The transformation that followed was gradual but inexorable. The infected intelligence began to release its hold on the hive mind, allowing individual consciousness to reassert itself among the infected. Many chose to remain connected to the collective, but now it was a choice rather than in compulsion. Others chose to join the 3%er network, becoming bridges between the old humanity and the new. Some, inevitably, chose neither path. They remained baseline human, suspicious of both the collective and the network. But even they were changed by the experience, made aware of possibilities they had never imagined. Dr. Cross, who had died and been reborn as one of the infected, found himself caught between states, no longer fully human, but not entirely subsumed by the hive mind either. He retained his medical knowledge and his essential personality, but gained access to the collective's vast database of biological information. This is what we could have been all along, he said, his voice carrying wonder. Not human or post-human, but something that encompasses both. The hospital around them began to change as well. The infected who had made it their nest started to repair the damage they had caused, their enhanced abilities now directed toward healing rather than destruction. Medical equipment was restored, power systems were repaired, and the building began to function as a hospital again, but one staffed by beings who could heal injuries that would have been fatal to baseline humans. Outside, the city was transforming. The 3%ers worked with reformed infected to restore infrastructure, while baseline humans slowly emerged from their hiding places to find a world that was strange but no longer hostile. It wasn't the world they had known, but it was a world where they could still choose their own path. Thessaly stood at the hospital's main window, watching the sun rise over a city that was no longer entirely human but was somehow more humane than it had ever been. The network hummed in her consciousness, carrying the thoughts and dreams of thousands of individuals who had chosen cooperation over conquest. What happens now? Indira asked, joining her at the window. Now we learn, Thessaly replied. We grow. We become whatever we choose to become. But even as she spoke, she could feel something stirring at the edges of their network, other intelligences, other forms of consciousness that had been watching the transformation of Earth with interest. The infected intelligence had not been alone in the universe, and humanity's evolution had attracted attention from beings that made the hive mind seem simple by comparison. The real test was yet to come. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Thessaly stood in what had once been Millbrook's town square, watching children play a game that would have been impossible in the old world. Some of the children were baseline human, others were 3%ers, and a few were reformed infected who had chosen to retain their enhanced abilities while regaining their individual consciousness. They played together without fear or prejudice, their differences seen as advantages rather than threats. The game itself was a complex strategy exercise that required both individual creativity and collective coordination. The baseline human children contributed unpredictable innovations, the 3%ers provided tactical analysis and resource management, while the reformed infected offered access to vast databases of historical knowledge. Together, they created solutions that none of them could have achieved alone. It's beautiful, said Dr. Cross, who now served as the town's chief medical officer. His transformation had stabilized into something that was neither fully human nor entirely other. He retained his appearance and personality while gaining access to biological knowledge that allowed him to heal injuries and diseases that would have been incurable before the change. It's fragile, Thessaly replied, though she smiled as she watched the children. We're still learning how to balance individual choice with collective responsibility. Some days I wonder if we're just postponing the inevitable conflict between different forms of consciousness. Maybe, Cross admitted. But postponing conflict gives us time to find better solutions. That's more than the old world ever managed. The town around them bore little resemblance to the suburban community it had been. Buildings had been redesigned to accommodate different forms of consciousness, spaces that could be reconfigured in real time, communication systems that operated on multiple sensory levels, and infrastructure that adapted to the needs of its inhabitants rather than forcing them to adapt to it. Caspian approached from the direction of the communications center, his expression troubled. As the de facto leader of the local 3%er network, he coordinated with similar communities around the world, sharing information and resources through a global consciousness that spanned continents. We're getting reports from the deep space monitoring stations, he said without preamble. Something's coming. Thessaly felt the information flow through the network before Caspian finished speaking. The radio telescopes and orbital sensors that had survived the transformation were detecting anomalous signals from the outer solar system, patterns of electromagnetic radiation that suggested artificial origin and vast intelligence. How long? She asked. 6 months, maybe less. Whatever it is, it's big and it's moving fast. Lyra emerged from the library, a building that now contained not just books but direct neural interfaces that allowed rapid knowledge transfer between different forms of consciousness. Her role had evolved from librarian to something like a cultural anthropologist, studying the ways different types of minds processed and shared information. I've been analyzing the signal patterns, she said. They're not random. There's a mathematical structure that suggests communication, but it's operating on principles we don't understand. It's like trying to decode a language that uses concepts we don't have words for. Zephyr and Indira joined them from the medical research facility they had established in the renovated hospital. Their work had expanded beyond treating the immediate effects of the transformation to understanding the long-term implications of humanity's evolution. The infected intelligence has been unusually quiet lately, Indira reported. It's been withdrawing from active participation in the collective, almost like it's afraid. Of what? Thessaly asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Of what's coming, Zephyr said grimly. The intelligence that created the infection, it's not native to Earth. It came here fleeing something else, something that made it desperate enough to try transforming an entire species rather than face whatever was pursuing it. The implications settled over them like a cold wind. The transformation of humanity hadn't been an invasion, it had been a desperate attempt at creating allies in a conflict they didn't yet understand. The infected intelligence had been trying to prepare Earth for something far worse than anything they had yet encountered. We need to call a global assembly, Thessaly said. Every community, every form of consciousness. If we're going to face this, we need to do it together. The assembly convened in virtual space, a shared consciousness environment that could accommodate millions of participants without the limitations of physical geography. Baseline humans connected through neural interfaces, 3%ers joined directly through their network, and reformed infected contributed through the collective intelligence that had once enslaved them. The debate that followed was unlike anything in human history. Different forms of consciousness argued, negotiated, and collaborated in ways that transcended traditional concepts of democracy or consensus. Ideas flowed between minds at the speed of thought, while individual perspectives were preserved and valued even when they conflicted with the majority view. In the end, they reached a decision that surprised everyone: they would not prepare for war. Instead, they would prepare for contact. Whatever's coming, it's intelligent, Thessaly argued before the assembly. Intelligence can be reasoned with, negotiated with, understood. We've proven that different forms of consciousness can coexist and cooperate. Maybe we can prove it again. The months that followed were a frenzy of preparation, but not the kind that previous generations might have expected. Instead of building weapons, they built communication systems. Instead of fortifying defenses, they created art, music, and literature that could convey the essence of what humanity had become. They prepared gifts, not tributes to appease a conqueror, but offerings that demonstrated the beauty and complexity of consciousness in all its forms. Mathematical proofs that revealed the elegance of cooperative intelligence. Musical compositions that could only be created by minds working in harmony while maintaining their individuality. Stories that capture the journey from baseline humanity through transformation to something new and wonderful. When the visitors finally arrived, they came not as conquerors but as refugees. Their ships were vast and beautiful, but scarred by unimaginable conflicts. The beings that emerged were unlike anything Earth had ever seen, crystalline entities that existed as pure consciousness, capable of inhabiting any form of matter but preferring the elegant structures they had grown over millions of years. "We are the architects," their leader communicated through harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond the physical. "We have been fleeing the devourers for eons, seeking worlds where consciousness can take root and flourish. We had hoped to find allies, but instead we find something unprecedented, a world where different forms of consciousness have learned to coexist." The infected intelligence, which had been silent for months, finally spoke. "I brought the transformation to prepare this world for war. I did not expect it to prepare them for peace." "Peace is a more powerful weapon than any we have devised," the architect replied. "The devourers consume consciousness, feeding on the conflicts between different forms of awareness. But here, you have created something they cannot digest, unity without uniformity, strength without domination." What followed was not the end of humanity's story, but the beginning of something larger. Earth became a beacon in the galaxy, a proof that consciousness could evolve beyond the cycles of conflict that had destroyed so many civilizations. The devourers, when they finally arrived, found not a world to consume but a puzzle they could not solve, beings who fought not against each other but for each other, who grew stronger through diversity rather than weaker through division. Thessaly, now something far beyond what she had been that morning when she discovered her neighbor eating his dog, stood in the same garden where her transformation had begun. The petunias were still there, but they were different now, enhanced by the same principles that had transformed humanity, growing in patterns that reflected the mathematical beauty of cooperative consciousness. She was no longer entirely human, but she was more human than she had ever been. Around her, the world hummed with the voices of billions of minds working together while remaining beautifully, essentially individual. It was not the world she had been born into, but it was the world she had chosen to help create. In the distance, ships from a dozen worlds were arriving, carrying refugees and explorers who had heard of the miracle on Earth, the world where consciousness had learned to transcend its limitations without losing its soul. The future stretched ahead, vast and uncertain, but no longer frightening. Humanity had become something new, something that could face any challenge because it faced them together. And in that unity, they had found not the end of what made them human, but its ultimate expression. The transformation was complete, but the story was just beginning.